We were talking yesterday about the ability for a woman herself to act as her own shaliach, to transport the get that her husband wants to give her, so she can transport the get from Chutz La'aretz to Eretz Yisrael. And once she gets to the Beis Din, she can declare B'fanai Nichtav or B'fanai Nechtam, and then she is thereby divorced. Now the obvious question is, why does she have to transport a get in order to be divorced? Once a get comes into her hands, she's a divorcee. So what's going on? What's this whole discussion about? So that's the Gemara's first question. A woman is divorced as soon as the get comes into her hands. So why would this be necessary at all? The husband makes a condition when he gives her the get. You know, just like the husband can make a condition and say, this is only your get if you eat a tomato today, he can make any arbitrary tanai. He can say, this is only your get on the condition that you travel to Beis Din Ploni in Tel Aviv, let's say, or wherever it is, and once you get there, this will be your get. So that's what we're talking about. So the Gemara says, but wait a minute, Sov Kimatya Asam Igar Shala. But then why does she have to act as a shaliach and say, B'fanai Nichtav, B'fanai Nechtam? If it's the fulfillment of it tonight, so fine. Excuse me. So really, the divorce was enacted in Chutz La'aretz, and she now needs to fulfill the condition of the get, which is to travel to Tel Aviv. So once she gets to the Beis Din in Tel Aviv, she should automatically be divorced. There's no process that she should have to go to once she gets to that Beis Din. So Ela Amar Rav Huna bar Manoach Mishmei de Rav Acha berei de Ravika de Amar Lo Kimatis Hasam Asnecheya Ara V'Shakle. So Rav Huna says in the name of Rav Acha, he says what's going on over here is that the husband tells the wife as follows: you are my shaliach to deliver that get to Beis Din Ploni, to that Beis Din, let's say in Tel Aviv. Okay? Once you get there, put the get on the ground. So you will have fulfilled your shlichus to deliver the get, and then pick it up again. Now the reason why the Gemara says that she has to put it down is because, as Rashi implies, if I'm a shaliach to deliver a get, I have to deliver it from one party to another party. I can't give it to myself. And consequently, she has to release it physically from her possession and then pick it up again in order for her to accept the get from the shaliach, which is, there has to be some separation between her as a shaliach and her as the divorcee. So the Gemara says, fine, that's possible. He'll tell her, put it down and then pick it up. And that's the way it's going to work. But the Gemara says, but wait a minute. But that shouldn't work, because there's another halacha in GITTEN that says that the man has to actually give it to her, either himself or via proxy. But if he puts it down in a free zone that does not belong to either of them, and then she picks it up, that's not giving. The Torah says v'nasan, he has to give it. Giving means directly from him to her, or via proxy, but not to put it down and for it to be out in the open in neither of their possessions, and then for her to pick it up. So Ela da Amar La Havi Shaliach Laholacha Atamatis Hasam. V'chimatis Hasam Havi Shliach Lekabala V'kablias Gitech. So the Gemara answers as follows. Very strange chap. But it's a chap that the husband wants to create a scenario that she'll only be divorced in this fashion. He says to her, listen, I'm appointing you as my shaliach to get the get to the Beis Din in Tel Aviv. Once you get to the Beis Din in Tel Aviv, you're then going to appoint yourself as your own shaliach to receive the get. In other words, you will change from being my shaliach to being your shaliach. And then, once you've appointed yourself as your shaliach, you'll accept the get on behalf of yourself, right? And in that way, you'll be divorced. Now, the Gemara assumes that, again, she can't be a shaliach of the husband and take it directly from the husband, because there's no changing of the guard. But in a situation where she makes herself her own shaliach, then that will circumvent that problem. So, she first is the husband's shaliach, then she transitions once she gets to Beis Din to being her own shaliach, And in that way, the get never leaves her hands. It goes directly from her husband to her via two proxies. One is she herself when she's her husband's proxy, and then it's her herself when she's her own proxy, and then she takes it from herself and is divorced thereby. That's the Gemara's solution. But then the Gemara says, but wait a minute, that's also going to be deficient because v'halo chazra shlichus eitzel haba'al. Now, this is a chisaron, this is a deficiency in the mechanism of shlichus. And it's a little bit difficult to understand, but I'm going to explain it the way Tosfos explains it, because Tosfos is easier for me personally to understand. We're going to see a Gemara later on that in order for a person to be a legitimate shaliach, they have to, shalichus by definition is delivering an object from party A to party B. But there's another requirement in order for a person to be a legitimate shaliach. As soon as he has made that delivery, he has to be able to go back to party A and say, I have fulfilled your shalichus, before reverting to someone else's shaliach. Now, in this situation, simultaneous to the shaliach, meaning the woman, fulfilling her shlichus, she is automatically now becoming another party's shaliach, and therefore does not have the independence to report back to the sender saying, I fulfilled your shlichus, before becoming someone else's shaliach. That is a rule that the Gemara sets down elsewhere. I don't know what the source is. We'll have to wait till we get to that Gemara DAF Samech something. It's on DAF Ayin Ches, excuse me. So the Gemara is going to learn that out, and so therefore you're not a valid shaliach. She's not a valid shaliach laholacha because she cannot report back to her husband saying that she's fulfilled her shlichus before becoming the shaliach of another party. Now hold on to your questions. I want to go through the process.
Clarification. I have a question. I'm just on your words. The shaliach has a requirement to report back,
to be able to report back. The shaliach has to have the ability to report back to the mishaleach before becoming someone else's shaliach. And since she immediately reverts from his shaliach to her own shaliach, she doesn't have that ability, and therefore her shlichus is not valid. So the Gemara says, okay, fine, I'll give you another solution. Da amar la heve shaliach laholacha adematis hasa. So this is what he tells her. You will be my shaliach to transport the get until you get to that Beis Din. V'chimatis hasam shavi shaliach lekabala. Once you get there, I want you to appoint a second shaliach to transport the get to my wife, you. Get Yankel. Find the Yankel off the street, give him the get, and tell him to give the get to you and back to you. And in so doing, you see, there is an allowance in halacha for one shaliach to appoint a second shaliach, as long as they're working for the same person. So therefore, he says to his wife, you take the get as my shaliach, transport it to the Beis Din. Then when you get to the Beis Din, I guess at that point you can tell the Beis Din, b'fonai nichtav u'b'fonai nechtam, give it to Yankel. Yankel will then give it back to you. Both of you are shlichim laholacha. Both of you will have fulfilled your shlichus, and thereby you will be divorced. So the Gemara now says, Haniach laman da'amar isha osa shaliach lekabel gita. I'm sorry. Let me just clarify. Let me just change that. Ask Yankel to be your shaliach to receive the get. That's what he's telling her. You are my shaliach. When you get to the Beis Din, ask Yankel to be your shaliach to accept the get on your behalf. So once Yankel accepts the get, then you're officially divorced via proxy. So the Gemara now says, Hanich laman da'amar isha osa shaliach lekabel gita miyad shaliach baila. Ela laman da'amar ena isha osa shaliach lekabel gita miyad shaliach baila ma'ika lameimar. But the Gemara says, but there's a machlokas whether that works. There's a machlokas as to whether, if a man appoints a shaliach to transport the get, is the woman permitted to appoint her own shaliach to receive the get from the husband's shaliach? Now, if it works, fine. But there's a man d'Omer that says it doesn't work. So how are you going to solve this problem? So taimamai mishum deika bizayon debal v'hacha bal lo kapid. But the Gemara says, now hold on a second. But what's the whole reason of that opinion that says that it doesn't work for the husband to appoint his shaliach and the woman to appoint her shaliach to receive the get? The reason is because we're worried that the husband may say that that's not the way I wanted the get to be given. You see, there is this concept of a man's honor or a man's degradation. And a man may have this sense of pride to say, I'm going to give my wife the get, and I want it to go to her directly. I don't want her to send a proxy. I want her to be there herself to receive it. He may be so intent on his own honor that he may even say that if she's going to send her proxy, I don't want it to be a valid get. And therefore, according to that opinion, the rabbis did not permit a woman to send her proxy if the husband is not aware of it. This is if the husband is aware of it, because let's say he's delivering the get in person, and instead of meeting up with the wife, he meets up with her proxy, and he says, here's the get, so then we know he consents to it. But if he sends his proxy, and he thinks that it's going to his wife, and instead she sends her proxy, then we have to worry that the husband may not consent to that get. And that's the reason why it's invalid. But over here, if the husband is giving his wife the instruction at the outset, and he's telling her, this is the way I want the divorce to work. I want you to be my shaliach, and then when you get to the base, then have your shaliach take it from you on your behalf. So then obviously he's not makbid. He doesn't have this issue of honor. So the Gemara now says, Hanicha leman da'amr mishum bizoyim debal, elo leman da'amr mishum chatzera habola acher mikan ma'ika lemeimar. But then the Gemara says, but wait a minute, there's a machlokes as to why the man da'amr who says it doesn't work. One opinion is because we're worried about the husband's pride and his honor. But there's another opinion that says that it's a special takanas chachamim, lest you get confused with the following case. Now, what is the case? We learned this halacha before. If a man deposits a get into his wife's chatzer, into his wife's courtyard, she is thereby divorced. But what if a man deposits a get into Yankel's chatzer, and then Yankel, after the get is already in that courtyard, sells or gives that courtyard to the woman? The woman is not divorced in that situation because there's not been a direct giving from the husband to the wife. There's been an interruption in the interim where the get was put in a place which doesn't belong to either of them. Correct? Okay, now, let's think about this. A person may look at that scenario and say, well, how is that any different from a shaliach acting as a proxy? I mean, after all, if you look at at a chatzer, as a piece of land, as sort of the representative of the individual, so then what's wrong with the husband saying, well, Yankel's property is my shaliach, and then Yankel's property will become my wife's property, and that'll be her shaliach, and thereby she'll be divorced. So what's wrong? If I put it in Yankel's courtyard, then it reverts to become my wife's property, and then the property is now her shaliach. It's like from my shaliach going to her shaliach. It should work. So because people might make that mistake and think that the mechanism whereby a woman is divorced when you deposit it in real estate is the same mechanism when you give it to a shaliach, the rabbis outright banned any kind of system whereby you're using his shaliach and her shaliach, lest it be confused with real estate. So Taka, the question is, why doesn't it work with real estate if it's a concept of shlichus? The answer is because real estate is a different mechanism from shlichus. There's a different mechanism that is being utilized in the delivery of a get via real estate. It's called yad. It's not called shlichus. There's two mechanisms. One is called yad, the other one is called shlichus. Shlichus is where the Torah says a proxy can act on, a human proxy can act on behalf of the original person. But yad is a different mechanism. It says that a person's property is an extension of that person's hand. Okay, so it's a totally different conceptual halachic mechanism. And it's because of that, by putting it in Yankel's courtyard before it belongs to his wife, it's putting it into Yankel's hand and then causing it to go into his wife's hand afterwards, since the land is not the shaliach of the husband, but rather someone else's hand, the whole mechanism breaks down and it doesn't work. So that's the reason why there's a differentiation in halacha between using real estate as a proxy versus using a human as a proxy. But because they're easily confusable with each other, the rabbis banned any time when there's a double shlichus of his shaliach and her shaliach. If that's the case, then how can you justify using that method over here if it's banned? So the Gemara says, okay, you got me. Da amar la hevi shaliach laholacha adamatis hasam v'chimatis hasam shavi shaliach laholacha bekablias giteich minei. This is what I was saying before. The husband says, okay, fine. You take the get on my behalf. You're my shaliach to transport the get to the Beis Din in Tel Aviv. Once you get to the Beis Din, I want you to give it to Yankel, but appoint Yankel as my proxy as well. Meaning that one shaliach can appoint another shaliach as long as that second shaliach is continuing the function of the first shaliach. So therefore, there's no two shalichim, my shaliach and the wife's shaliach. It's rather both people, both the woman, the wife, and Yankel are both acting as the husband's shalichei holacha, the shalichim on behalf of the husband to transport the get. And therefore, when you stand in the Beis Din after Yankel has it, he'll give it to you, and you'll be divorced. So there's no problem of using his shaliach and her shaliach. Both shalichim are his shalichim, and therefore the process works. The ibayis ema, alternative answer, is the amar la hevi shaliach laholacha adamatis asam. He says to her, listen, you transport the get to the Beis Din in Tel Aviv. The chimatis hasam, emer kamei beidina. When you get there, tell the Beis Din b'fanai nichtav v'fanai nechtam, umashvi beidina shaliach, v'leisvei nihalech. And then Beis Din will appoint a shaliach, who they will say that the shaliach will be Beis Din shaliach, and because once you said b'fanai nichtav v'fanai nechtam, it now becomes under the jurisdiction of Beis Din. Beis Din will take possession of the get, and then Beis Din will give you the get, acting as the shaliach for Klal Yisrael, so to speak. And that is a valid delivery of the get from husband to wife. That is a form of vinosan, as long as the Beis Din is involved in the shlichus. And therefore, that's the second way where the husband can organize the structure whereby his wife is a shaliach for her own get. Hadron Allah Hamevi get. Yes.
There's no such thing.
So
the Rabbi is concerned that if the husband's able to make it tonight, he could make very unreasonable and humiliating tonight.
Yes. We haven't yet seen the humiliation factor yet, right? In other words, this is not necessarily humiliating, it's just really inconveniencing her in some way to require to travel to Eretz Yisrael for the get to be enacted. I agree that it is possible, and there may be Torah violations that the husband is committing when he places these conditions of onoas devarim, of afflicting her either emotionally or physically. But the Gemara is not addressing that here. The Gemara is saying mechanically does it work or not.
There's no such thing as her putting it down right where her feet are, as if that's her chutzner, and it's an extension of her yad.
That's an interesting thought, because normally, like the Gemaras, I think in Bava Metzia, say that a person's Dalet Amos are kona for the person. Apparently the Gemara doesn't hold of that concept over here, unless maybe if she were to go to a Makom Hefker, maybe that would work. But if the husband says go to the Beis Din isn't a Makom Hefker. So let's say if I go into your house, I'm not kind of the Dalet Amos that's around me. It has to be a Makom Hefker. So maybe, perhaps you could argue that if it was a Makom Hefker that the husband told her to go, maybe she could drop it.
Right.
But it's still not leaving her possession at any moment. So that could still.
It's a chutzner then. If it's out of her hand, it's a chutzner now. It's on her feet, next to her feet.
Yeah, but it's chutzner is kiyad, so it's still never leaving her person.
It doesn't help you.
I don't think it's going to help. Hadron alachamevi get kol get shenichtav shelo l'shum isha apostle. The topic of the third parak is to clarify what it means when we say the get has to be written lishma. It has to be written for that woman. And remember, we learned that there's a machlokas between Rabbi Meir and Rebbe Lazar as to whether the text of the get has to be written lishma or just the signatures of the Edom have to be written lishma. Let's just, for simplicity's sake, assume that we're working under the rubric that the text of the get has to be written lishma, and all of this therefore will make a lot more sense. Anyway, any get that is written not for that specific woman is puzzle. Ketzad haya over b'shuk v'shama kol sofer makran ish ploni megarish es plonis mimakom ploni v'omar zeh shmi v'zeh shem ishti puzzle legarish bo. Let's talk about the following scenario. A man is walking through Machane Yehuda, and he hears all of a sudden someone in one of the booths saying, let's write, Yankel from Tel Aviv is divorcing his wife Leah. And he says, hey, wait a minute, my name's Yankel, I'm from Tel Aviv, and my wife's name is Leah. What a coincidence. It must be fate that I should be here so that I can divorce my wife. Sir, I'd like to purchase that piece of paper from you. Would that be okay? So the Gemara says that's puzzle because it was not written for this Yankel and for this Leah. Okay? So Yeser Mikain, and says the Gemara, I'll go even further. Now these words, I'll go even further, implies that now we're going to see an even bigger chiddush of when the get is puzzle. Kasav lagarish is ishto v'nimlach, mitzo ben iro v'amar lo shmi kishmecha v'shem ishti kishem ishtecha puzzle lagarish bo. Yankel is writing a get for his wife, and after he finishes writing it, he has a change of heart and says, you know what, I think I'll give it one more chance. But all of a sudden, his friend, whose name is also Yankel, comes by and says, you know, my name's your name, my wife's name is the same name as your wife's name, and I can't stand her. Do you mind if I use your get to divorce my wife? So the Mishnah says that's also puzzle. Now, how is that any different from the previous case? We'll see in a moment. Now, Yeser Mikain, I'll go even one step further, says the Gemara. Hayu lo shtei nashim ushmosei and shavos. Kasav legaresh es hakdola lo yegarish bo es haktana. Yankel has two wives. Both of their names are Leah. It's pretty confusing in the household. Leah, where'd I live my cufflinks? Which Leah are you talking about? Anyway, he's getting very confused. He's got to downsize anyway, so he figures, you know what? I'm going to divorce one of my wives. So he initially thinks he's going to divorce Leah number one. But then he changed his mind and says, I can't divorce Leah number one. All right, I'll use it for Leah number two. Or the Mishnah says, puzzle. Can't use it because it wasn't written for Leah number two. It was written for Leah number one. Okay, and then Yeser Mikain. And then even a bigger chiddush, I'll say, like this. Amar lo lavlair ksov le'ezer she'erza agaresh pasul agaresh bo. He says to the sofer, you know what, I got two wives. Each one's name is Leah. And I know I got to downsize and get rid of one of them, but I'm not sure which one. So just write it for Leah. And then when I get home, I'll decide which one I want to give it to.
After Sunday.
Right. Whichever one makes me a better dinner, right? Right? So there the Mishnah also says that it's no good. Why? Because here are the chiddushs you can see. Because even though he didn't specifically write it for Leah 1, he wrote it generically either for Leah 1 or Leah 2. He can't use it because it was not written for any one specific wife. Now the Gemara now says it's going to clarify. We've seen 4 cases. Let's just review the 4 cases. He's walking by the shuk and he hears a sofer reading what he's writing, and it's got, by coincidence, it's his name and his wife's name, puzzle. Second case, he writes a get for his wife and changes his mind, and his friend wants to use it for his wife, puzzle. Third case, he's got 2 wives whose names are the same. He wants to use it for number 1 originally, cannot change his mind to use it for number 2. Case number 4, he's got 2 wives with the same name and tells the sofer, write it generically and I'll decide later, also puzzle. So the Gemara now says, Kasav lagaris is ishto v'nimlach. Ve'elaresha b'mai. So the Gemara says, how are cases 1 and 2 different from each other? Case 2 is that it was written for one person, for him and to divorce his wife, and then the guy says, you know what, I'd like to buy that get and use it for my wife. How is that any different from case number 2, where Yankel 1 decides to write it for Leah, his wife, and Yankel 2 comes over and says, I'd like to use it instead? How are those 2 cases any different? In both cases, it was written for one party, for one man, and now it's changing to the other man, and that's why it's puzzle. So the Gemara says, I'll tell you the difference. Amar of Papa besofrin hasuyin lehislamed askina. Case number 1 is where the piece of paper was not written as a get at all. It was, the guy was walking by a scribal school where students are being taught how to be sofrin. And in order to train the teacher is teaching them how to practice writing a get. So he just pulls out two names out of a hat, right? Yaakov is divorcing Leah from Tel Aviv on such and such a date, and it just so happens that this guy, by coincidence, walks by. The point is that it's invalid not because it was a get for one person wants to be used for another person. It's invalid because it was never even written as a get at all in the first place. So that's the difference between case 1 and case 2. Case 2 is that even though it was written as a get, but it wasn't written for this Yaakov and this Leah, that's why it's possible. So Amar Ravashi dikanami to katani sofrin makrin velo katani sofrin korin shmamina. So the Ravashi says it's actually inferable from the language that what you just said is true, Rav Papa, because it says that the sofrin, the scribes, are reciting it for others. And doesn't say that the Sofrim are reading it as they're writing it. He said if the Mishnah would have said they're reading it Korean, then that might imply that they're writing a get for somebody else, and they're just reading the words out loud as they're writing it. But the fact that it says Makrin, which means they're reciting it for others, means that we're talking about a scribal school, a school for Sofrim, and that's why it's not being written for anyone. So Ma Yeser Mikain. So now the next question is, okay, so then what's the bigger chiddush of case number 2? So Tana Devei Rabbi Shmuel, Lo zeh shenichtav shelo l'shum gerushin, ela af zeh shenichtav l'shum gerushin pasel. So as we spoke out already, the chiddush of case number 2 is, as the Tana Devei Rabbi Shmuel speaks out, is that not only is a get pasel when it was not written for the sake of a get at all, which was the case of the guy walking through the shuk, but even when a get was written for the purposes of divorce, but written for a different party, that's why it's puzzle. Now we go to case number 3. Velo zeh shenichtav shelo l'shum gerushin didei, ela av zeh shenichtav l'shum gerushin didei puzzle. Case number 3 is, in other words, case number 2 is where the man is a different yankel. It's yankel number 1 as you originally thought to use it. Now we want to switch it to yankel number 2. Case number 3 is, even if it's the same yankel, but it's just that he has 2 different wives, that's the chiddush, that even though it's the same megaresh, the same husband, you still can't use the get if it's for a different wife. And then case number 4 is, Velo zeh shelo nichtav l'shum gerushin ha, ela av zeh shenichtav l'shum gerushin ha, pasul. So the case number 4 is that if you just had case number 3, you would say the reason it's pasul is because he writ it with the intent of Leah number 1. He can't now change it to Leah number 2. Case number 4 is, let's say he had it written both for Leah number 1 and Leah number 2, generically, to cover his bases, to hedge his bets. He says, that too is puzzle. And why is that? Because you can't hedge your bets by a get, as we'll see in just a moment. So my taima, so what's the reason for all of these cases to be puzzle? Ikasa v'nasan sefer krisus biyada. So now the Gemara says, let's go through the pasuk. The pasuk in the Torah says, v'chasav la sefer krisus v'nasan biyada. He shall write for her a book of severance and place it in her hand. So what we learn from the way that this verse is structured is as follows. If the Torah would have written, v'nasan sefer krisus biyada, he shall place a book of severance in her hand, without talking about how he's going to write it, hava amina limeute heichkama de lo avid l'shum krisus. Aval kosav l'garish es ishto v'nimlach de avid l'shum krisus, ema kasher. I would have thought, if the Torah didn't talk about him writing it, that the only requirement of the Torah is that it has to be written for the sake of being a book of severance. And therefore, if it's not written as a get, like in case number 1, it's puzzle. But if it's written for the purpose of a get, even if it wasn't written for that specific party, it's still usable. And therefore, kasav rachmana v'chasav. And that's why the Torah says, he shall write. Meaning the same yankel who wrote it is the one who has to use the get. And if he can't, and he can't give it to somebody else. I kasav rachmana v'chasav hava mina lemuute hay de lo ihu kakasiv la. Aval yesh lo shtei nashim de ihu kakasiv la ema kasher. So therefore, kasav rachmana la lishma. Now, why does the Torah have to say v'kasav la? What does the Torah need the word la? If the Torah would not have used the word la, I would have thought, as long as the same yankel who wrote it is the same yankel who's using it, it's kosher. Comes along case number 3 to say v'chasav la. Not only does it have to be the same yankel, it has to be the same Leah. And therefore, he's got to write it for her, for that specific woman. So therefore, it's coming to exclude a case where a man has two wives with the same name. If he originally wrote it for Leah 1, he cannot now use it for Leah number 2. And that's what the word la means. It has to be for that specific woman. The Seifa Lamali. So now let's look at case number 4. Why is case number 4 no good? He is writing it for Leah number 1 and Leah number 2, and he'll make up his mind later. The Gemara answers, HaKamash Malan de'ein breira. The chiddush is of our Mishnah that we don't hold of retroactivity. Since it has to be written for one specific woman, a man cannot say, I'll decide tomorrow which specific woman this get is being written for. Retroactively, it'll be reflected that it was written specifically for Leah number 1. You don't have an option of doing that because we don't hold of retroactivity. We don't hold of breira. Now let's go weiter. Kosav legarish es hagdola lo yagarish bo es aktana. If a man originally wrote it to divorce Leah number 1, he cannot now use it to divorce Leah number 2. So ketanahu delo matzi megarish be, hagedola matzi megarish be. But the Gemara says, but it could be used for Leah number 1. Now that in itself could be confusing, because what if Leah number 1 is given the get, and she makes the claim that my husband, when he wrote it, did not write it for me. He wrote it for Leah number 2. Can't we give credence to that taina? So the Gemara says, you see from here that you don't. And Amar Rava Zoso Meres Shnei Yosef ben Shimon Hadarin Be'ir Echas Motziin Shtarcho Balacherim. And this proves the following halacha, that in the event that you have two people in the same town, the same city of Tel Aviv, both names are Shimon ben Yosef, and one of them, Yosef ben Shimon, and one of them produces a promissory note as a creditor to a debtor, the debtor can't claim afterwards, get out of my face. You're not the person that I owe the money to. I owe the money to the other Shimon ben Yosef. You see that that's not a valid claim. The very fact that the creditor approaches the debtor with the promissory note is in itself prima facie evidence that he is the creditor, even though there's a possibility that he's not, and that the other person is the creditor and he just found it. We don't give credence to that kind of argument. Similarly, if a husband uses the get for Leah number 1, she can't turn around and claim that it was really written for Leah number 2. Now, Amarle Abaye Elameata, Reisha de Katani Shmi Kishmecha Pasul Garesh Bo, Shani Hu Dolomatzi Magaresh Be, Harishon Matzi Magaresh Be. But now let's take a look at a case of not where there's Leah number 1 and Leah number 2 from the same husband. Let's take a look at a case where you've got two men whose name are Yankel. And Yankel number 1 wrote the get for his wife, and now Yankel number 2 wants to use it instead. We said that it's not usable for Yankel number 2. But can Yankel number 1 use it, even though there's another Yankel in the town with the same wife's name? Yes, he can. And Vaha Amrin, so the question is, Vaha Amrinan velo acher yachol lahotzi alehen shtarchov? But there is such a halacha that's brought in Bava Basra that says that if Yankel or Yosef ben Shimon, in the case of the Gemara, is the debtor and not the creditor, let's say a creditor comes over to Yosef ben Shimon. I'm Yosef ben Shimon, a creditor comes over to me and he says, listen, here's the promissory note, pay me the money that you owe me. The Gemara says that I have a right to say to him, I don't owe you that money. Well, that Yosef ben Shimon that's written in the note, that's another Yosef ben Shimon, he lives down the block. So don't come to me. The Gemara says that that's a valid claim. And until you can bring evidence that I'm the Yosef ben Shimon that borrowed the money, you can't take me to, you can't extract money from me in court. So if that's the case, the question now is, why can't a woman turn around to her husband when he gives her a get? Why can't she say to him, you can't use that to divorce me because that note was not written for me. It was written for another Yankel and another Leah. So I deny that this is a valid get. Why can't she make that claim according to this Gemara? So the Gemara's answer is, Elamai islach lememar be'edei mesira v'rebel azerhi, hachanami be'edei mesira v'rebel azerhi. The only way that a creditor can extract money from Yosef ben Shimon when there's two Yosef ben Shimons is if there are Eidim who witnessed the transaction, who witnessed the actual loan. And so too, you would have to say over here too, the reason why the woman cannot make this claim, that this get is not good because it was really written by another Yankel for his wife, and it wasn't written for me, is because there are witnesses who see the husband transmitting the get from the man to the wife, and the witnesses have to be able to say that the get was written bekashrus by Yankel. So therefore, that's what you have to say over here. You have to say that the witnesses are crucial to the corroboration of the get, that it really was written by Yankel, the one who's divorcing his wife. And that's why the woman does not have a valid taina. So the Gemara says we're basically forced to commit ourselves that the whole reason why the get works is because we go like Rabbi Lazar here, who requires Edei Mesira. Now let's go on to the next sugya. Amar Rav, Kulan Poslan B'Kahuna Chutz Min Harishon. We're going to see a machlokas between Rav and Shmuel and some other Amoraim. Now, if in all four cases of our Mishnah the get is puzzle, but what if a husband gives it to his wife? She's not divorced halachically. The husband has to redo the get. However, there's a concept of even when a man uses a puzzle get and gives it to his wife, she is considered divorced vis-a-vis a chumrah that she's no longer allowed to marry a kohen. So, for example, let's say a man gives his wife a puzzle get, and then he dies 5 minutes later. Can she marry a kohen? The halacha is no, even though the get was not valid, but there's something called reach haget, that if there's the fragrance of a get that is attached to this woman, she midarabanan is stigmatized that she can no longer marry a kohen. So comes along Rav and says, in all the cases of our Mishnah, even though the get is puzzle, if a man gives it to his wife, she's not allowed to marry a kohen, even if the man dies afterwards, except for case number one. In case number one, it was not ever written as a get at all. So there's not even reach haget in that case. And Ushmuel Amar Af Rishon Nami Posa. But Shmuel disagrees. And he says no. He says even get number one, because it looks like a get, it quacks like a get, even though it wasn't written for the sake of a get, it does still have reach haget, and therefore she will be puzzled to the kahuna. Va'az the Shmuel l'taimei da'amar Shmuel kol makom sheshanu chachamim get puzzle uposel. Because Shmuel said that any time the chachamim looked at a get and said it's a puzzle a get, it still has the potency to preclude her from the kahuna if it's given to her, which would include case number one as well. And furthermore, chalitza psula uposlasam in ha'achim. And furthermore, Shmuel said that any time the rabbi said that a chalitza that was done improperly is puzzle, it nevertheless precludes her from being able to do yibum with any of the brothers. In other words, if a chalitza that was not kosher was done, it has to be repeated, but it has the potency l'chumra to preclude her from doing yibum in the same vein. But b'marava amri, but in Eretz Yisrael they argue with Shmuel and they say it depends in the nature of the psul of the chalitza. Mishmei de Rabbi Lazar, small v'layla psulos uposlos, they said it depends. If something functional about the chalitza was missing, let's say, for example, she used the man's left foot for removing the shoe instead of the right foot, or let's say she did the chalitza at nighttime instead of doing the chalitza during the daytime, but everything else was functionally accurate, so then it passes her from the kahuna. But let's say there was something so much more fundamentally flawed with the chalitza that it wasn't a chalitza at all, such as an example, katan v'anpilia, pisulos ve'ein poslos. If let's say the yavam is a minor, so there, the Gemara in Yavamas had said she has to wait for him to become an adult before she can do chalitza. So if she does chalitza with a minor, then it's totally meaningless, and she's not puzzle from the kahuna. And furthermore, if let's say she uses, instead of a chalitza shoe, she uses a chalitza sock, so then that also is totally invalid and does not even puzzle her from the kahuna. So far we've seen Rav and Shmuel. Now we're going to see the opinion of Ze'eri. Ze'eri Omar Kulan Ein Poslin Chutz Min Ha'achara. That Ze'eri says just the opposite. In all of these Pasal GITTEN, she is still kosher to the kahuna, except for case number 4. Case number 4 is where he tells the sofer, write it generically and I'll decide later. That's the closest to being a kosher get, even though it's pasul, so only that case will pasul her from the kahuna. V'chein omer Ravasi kulan ein posen chutz min ha'achron. And Ravasi said the same thing. But Rabbi Yochanan Amar af achron nami eino posel. Now we have the 4th opinion of Rabbi Yochanan, who says that none of these pasul gittin will pasul her from the kahuna because they're so off base. Va'az the Rabbi Yochanan l'taimei, and Rabbi Yochanan is consistent. He says even in case number 4, it doesn't pasul her from the kahuna because we go so far as to say ein breira, there's no retroactivity when a guy says I'll hedge my bets, that it's not a get at all. The Amar Ravasi Amar Rabbi Yochanan ha'achin shecholku lukuchos hein machzirin zela ze biyovel. And the example that Rabbi Yochanan, another case where Rabbi Yochanan also is emphatic in saying ein breira, is in the case of Yerusha, the case of inheritance. Let's say a man dies, he leaves over 2 sons, and so the sons divide the estate between each other, and but the father did not designate which property goes to which son. So in that situation, the brothers can say, well, Dad had 2 fields, a northern field and a southern field. We own jointly both fields. I'll take the north field, you take the south field. Now that's legal, they can do that, but it's a halachic barter. There's no such thing as saying retroactively the older brother got the northern field from Dad and the younger brother got the southern field from Dad. And because it's a barter that takes place after death, post-mortem, the halacha therefore is that because it's considered to be a sale and not a Yerusha, then when Yovel arrives, the fields go back to the original conglomerate estate, and they have to redivide the field again at Yovel. So you see from that case that Rabbi Yochanan holds that there's no breira. You don't hold of retroactivity. You can't say, well, because I took the north field, that was my original Yerusha retroactively. Now, the Gemara's question now is, we've seen 2 cases where Rabbi Yochanan says emphatically ein breira. One is the case by the get, where it's so not a get because ein breira that it doesn't even pasul her from the kahuna, and the case of the brothers inheriting that it's so not a Yerusha that at Yovel it reverts back to the original combined estate and they have to redivide it. The question now is, why did Rabbi Yochanan have to make this emphatic statement of ein breira in both cases? I'll tell you why, says the Gemara. Utsricha. Di'i itmar beha ka'amar Rabbi Yochanan de ein breira mishum deba'inan la lishma. Aval hasa mecherhu da amar rachman ali hadar biyovel aval Yerusha matana lo. I'll tell you why. If Rabbi Yochanan would have only said ein breira by the case of get, there's no retroactivity, maybe because there's a special requirement by GITTEN that you have to know in advance to which specific woman you're writing the get. But it could be that when it comes to cases of Yerusha, maybe Rabbi Yochanan would assent to the possibility that as long as we're not buying and selling property, but we're just saying, okay, brother, you take the north and I'll take the south, then that's a possibility of retroactivity. There's no chisaron, there's no deficiency in the mechanism of our Yerusha, and therefore maybe at Yovel it wouldn't go back. And therefore Rabbi Yochanan has to make an emphatic statement that even in the case of Yerusha, there's no breira. V'iyash me'inan sada mishum de lechumra, inami kitchila, aval hacha emalod sricha. And finally, if Rabbi Yochanan would have only said ein breira by the case of Yerusha, maybe it's only there that he says ein breira because he's being machmir. He's saying that, you know what, you have to be machmir and redivide the estate at Yovel. But to say ein breira to the point of being makel, to say that not only is it not a get, but she's still mutter to the kahuna, maybe Rabbi Yochanan was not prepared to go so far. Alternatively, maybe Rabbi Yochanan only said there's no breira by Yerusha because you're reverting things back to their original state of being the father's estate, that originally it belonged to one person, and now we recombine it to belong to one person. But over here to say that it's so much not a get that she's not divorced at all, you're not returning her back to an original state of what she was at her point of origin, and therefore maybe Rabbi Yochanan is not prepared to say so far ein breira. And therefore, it says the Gemara, you need both cases so that we know that Rabbi Yochanan holds completely ein breira in both cases. Have a wonderful day. Rabbi Chanani ben Akasha Omer Ratzah HaKadosh Baruch Hu L'Zachus Es Yisrael Leficha Chir B'Lem Torah U'Mitzvos.